Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming. We are, I think, the only panel on Latin America in the festival. So if you're here, you're either my 7-week-old son that is forced to be here, or you probably have a vested interest or an interest in the region. Of course, 55 minutes to talk about Latin America is a bit of a joke. It's a huge region, and we've all got a bunch of experience in several countries, but the idea really right here is to highlight some of the larger trends that happen in the region and some of the elements of interest that readers and viewers also in Europe may have towards the region. And some of the challenges of that coverage. So we have a great panel. There's here, to start to my left, there's Arturo Wallace, who's from Nicaragua, and he's now with BBC Mundo, which is the BBC's Latin American Spanish language service. Of course, has covered several countries in the region, was a correspondent in Colombia as well. There's Carola Soler Casas, who's from Spain, was a correspondent for news agencies EFE and AFP in Venezuela, then Mexico, and then Brazil, and just recently back in Spain. And there's John Lee Anderson that is hard to introduce. Started his career in Latin America, has written the biography of Che Guevara that you may have read, and has worked everywhere in the world, has a lot of experience that he will share with us. And as for me, I've been based in Latin America for about 10 years as a freelance correspondent for international media and as a BBC correspondent as well. I was based in Chile, in Venezuela, Ecuador, and also in Argentina most recently. We're talking about the role of foreign correspondents in Latin America, which is something that is very important in a region that is very polarized and deadly for local journalists in many cases. So many times foreign correspondents have the independence and the possibility to report on things that local correspondents cannot report on. So it is definitely an important role that we play. But I wanted to start with another anecdote, actually. When I was reporting in Ecuador, I was based there for 4 years as a freelance. I was hearing that the government was interested in granting asylum to a guy called Assange, and I was trying to sell that story to different media, and my editors were saying, I don't know, Ecuador, why are we interested? Until one newspaper was, jumped on board. It was The Guardian, very interested in Assange. And all of a sudden I had a scoop. We covered the fact that the government was going to give Assange asylum, and that was because, The Guardian had a vested interest in Assange and the story that was going to develop there. So, maybe we can start with a bigger question, like, are we as foreign correspondents just maybe trying to fit within a certain narrative? Are we trying to what do we have to do to cover Latin America for a foreign audience? And have things changed? So, John Lee, maybe you want to open with some thoughts there.
No, I think the anecdote's really useful to talk about really being a correspondent and covering the reality anywhere, but in particular Latin America, which has never been neuralgic to the great powers' geostrategic interests. With a few exceptions, the 1980s when President Reagan got on primetime television and pointed to the map famously of Nicaragua and El Salvador, and he talked about how communism could come from there up and invade us and infect us, and declared that it was necessary to take a series of drastic measures to intervene in that region in order to stave off communism, the threat of communism. In a sense, we're seeing that kind of return now with Trump. But at the time, it's hard to imagine, but I remember covering the Salvadoran elections in 1984. 700 journalists arrived for that event. And by the end of the Civil War in the early 90s, there was nobody left. And so 20 years went by in which you saw the buildup of gang organizations. The wars all ended in impunity, similar to what happened, in fact, modeled on Franco's Spain, el Pacto de Olvido. So you had people who were effectively, by that time, political serial killers out on the streets, and in some cases infusing the societies with their hyper violence. By this time, it was also a region that had been seriously compromised. Where there were fragile democracies, they were undermined and they were compromised. And we see the effects of that today in the flows of immigration, the endemic poverty, the lack of rule of law, endemic injustice, and in a word, the mess that we see today, which is not being made any easier or better by the US policies, the dominant power in the region. As journalists, we've always been, in my view and in my experience, very, very, to maybe a shameful degree. I think there are independent spirits amongst us, and there are plenty of freelance journalists who have the benefit, who they have to carry the burden of poverty and lack of notoriety, or but on the other, or celebrity. But on the other hand, they may have the ability to retain a kind of ethical, moral compact more easily than those who work for big organizations, because the big media organizations, in my experience over time, tend to follow whatever the presidential palace decides is strategic or of interest or of a national priority at any given time. And that's certainly been the case with Latin America. It's Latin America barely got a look in from the end of the Cold War to, fast forward, let me think, Barack Obama shaking hands with Raul Castro, surprising the world in his quite extraordinary historic attempt to bury the hatchet, to turn history around on its head. Can any of us imagine that was only 3 years ago that happened? Sorry, now 5. But now we have 2 years of Trump, and what we've seen is a wholesale reversal in terms of political attitude, political posture, and also language, rhetoric, and the way the region is being treated and dealt with. It's more of a throwback to an earlier era. And so all I would say, so as not to go on too long, is that it's useful to look at history for those of us who are coming into the field for the first time in a region like Latin America, which is suddenly neuralgic again. Why is it neuralgic again? When I say neuralgic, I mean somehow potent, dynamic, of media interest. Because it's difficult to describe him as that, but nonetheless, the leader of the once free world, the most powerful nation on earth, the United States, has made it so. It may be for the entirely the wrong reasons, and I would argue that they are for the wrong reasons. But nonetheless, he's torn the wallpaper off, a room full of inequities, full of difficulties. We know he's not the solution, and we're all going to be reacting to the problems he's unveiled, and in some cases causing. We're now seeing in Venezuela, to just end on that note, a kind of, to kind of complete the fast forward idea, a kind of Cold War 2.0, with the arrival now, just in the past 2 weeks, of not many, but nonetheless uniformed Russian military advisors and then Chinese military advisors. This is the first time, again, history is important to keep in mind, that something like that has happened since the Cold War. So we're seeing a kind of great game emerge, and for the first time in a long time, it's including Latin America. Latin America is now seen as a viable chessboard for a whole host of reasons on which the great powers, now in more naked competition with one another, can play and compete. And so we now, so I would just end on that note. I point out that, it's somehow humiliating to realize that it's so difficult to cover a region. If this was about Africa, we could make similar arguments about Africa, or parts of Asia that never get a look in either. But the fact of the matter is that we remain as a gremio, as a kind of loose union of journalists, incredibly dependent to this day on the whims, the caprices, and the diktat of the people who happen to have political power in our countries at that time. And that's something I think we always need to hold in mind and to try to somehow overcome, because it doesn't serve our interests, it doesn't serve the public's interests. We're always having to do catch up, and we shouldn't have to do catch up. We should be able to provide some kind of intellectual and intellectually honest continuity in our coverage of regions, and that includes Latin America. Yeah, that's what I would say. Yeah.
So maybe you can come forward if you like. There's you can sit on the floor and maybe make yourself comfortable if you're just packed over there. But maybe Arturo, you want to jump in here, Central America.
No, yeah, of course. I mean, there are many things that to talk about starting from what John Lee said. From the complexity of talking about Latin America as a whole, for instance, which is also part of the problem. We're talking about a continent of, you can fit the European Union 4 times in Latin America. Just Brazil is twice the size of the European Union. We're talking about nearly 20 million people, and many languages. People tend to think, well, it's Spanish, of course, Portuguese, French, Haiti, but you also have a lot of different, indigenous languages that still are vibrant and important in certain countries, a huge diversity. And we talk, even in this panel, we're talking about Latin America as a whole. And I remember, Irene, I believe, just gave me the word because I told her I really want to talk about Central America because people don't think about Central America when they're talking about Latin America. Actually, and I guess Carola is greatly positioned to talk about it. For a lot of time, for major media organizations, Latin America has been either Brazil. In the runoff to the World Cup and the Olympics, pretty much every media organization put their scarce resources, in terms of foreign correspondence in Brazil. Everybody moved there because there were 2 big stories coming and so on and so forth, as she's reported from there. Either Brazil, Mexico, because of the proximity with the United States, and because it has become part of Trump's local political discourse, and Venezuela, because it was a big reference of the left even in Europe, of certain type of left in Europe. The world is quite. As part of the BBC World Service, I can attest of the interest that there has been on Venezuela, and especially on Chavez, probably more than in Venezuela, all over the world. From India, Zimbabwe, in Africa, in Asia, in many different places. We got calls from colleagues from different services, from languages that I didn't know existed, to ask us, to provide information and context about Chavez. But those were those 3 countries, basically. And therefore, and of course, we also talk about the media as a whole, and there are, of course, differences, maybe just to acknowledge them very quickly because of some academic itches that I still have, there are, of course, differences between country and country, and then again, Carola will be brilliantly placed to explain, of course, is different, or maybe not so much, but yes, on how with Spain, that has this direct connection, and therefore, should be more interested in what's going on in Latin America than the rest of the world, or organizations such as the BBC, which has the World Service, REMIT, to inform a global audience and report from a little, than, other media that probably cater for more specific audience. But of course, this focusing on only a few countries and this focusing on only a few moments result in us not being able to do what we should be doing, which is actually provide people, with a good understanding of a very complex and moving reality. And Central America is quite an example. Central America, that was, as John Lee said, the hub of international journalism for a while. I still remember reading that one given moment in 83, 84, it was the 5th biggest item in American media. They used to talk more about Nicaragua. They used to talk about the UK in the United States, because of the Contra War and so on and so forth. Completely vanished from the map. Completely vanished. Maybe made a return in some, very specific pieces about how Honduras is the murder capital of the world, no, how El Salvador is the murder capital of the world, and that's it. And then when it became a priority of United States domestic policy with the child migrant, you know, like being stranded at the border and so on and so forth. And in a way, you know, like I wonder whether this focus, this very narrow focus and very casual focus every now and then on gangs and murders and so on and so forth, and I'm not denying that Latin America is the most violent region in the world, you know, like outside of war zones. You know, if you take a list of the 50 most dangerous murderous cities in the world, you know, like 47 of them, I believe, are in Latin America. Yeah. And the top 10 is exclusively Latin American, you know, like, but I wonder to which certain extent, you know, like we actually fed and gave tools to Donald Trump's narrative of, you know, like people coming from the border are murderers and criminals and etc. Because, you know, like the last time that people in the United States and maybe, you know, in Europe as well heard about Central Americans, it was in that context, you know. Or you take a situation like Nicaragua, which is also that I really wanted to take advantage of this panel, you know, like to talk about it. Being Nicaragua as I am, you know, last time people heard about Daniel Ortega, he was an icon of the left, you know, like the leader of a revolutionary country that had been aggressed by the United States, the Contras, you know, Reagan saying, I'm a Contra too, funding a lot of money. You know, like fast forward many years later, you know, like there are like protests and a huge repression, 327 people at least killed just because of protesting against the government. But of course, you know, for a lot of people, well-meaning people, you know, like who have a healthy mistrust of big media and international corporation, you know, like last time they heard, you know, like this guy was, you know, as I said, a leftist icon. And of course, you know, it becomes very easy for them to believe what Ortega is trying to convince the world of, that this was a coup organized from Washington again, you know, against a legitimate president elected, you know, like, and I remember the BBC, even though I think we tried to do a good work and everything, saying he won the elections fair and square. And yeah, he won elections with, I believe it was 69% of the vote. You know, every time somebody wins an election with 69% of the vote, you have to ask yourself, you know, like how clean those elections were, you know, and by using those shortages, you make it very easy for him to fit into that narrative, you know, like, because we haven't reported for the, you know, like all these years he has been in power, how he got elected despite the Constitution forbidding, you know, a re-election, how actually he was not a foe of the United States, but actually the United States' best friend in the region, you know, like Nicaragua was the country putting a stop to people trying to cross from South America into the United States via Central America. You know, like there were a lot of Cubans stranded in the Costa Rica-Nicaraguan border. He was the best body of the DEA in the fight against drug trafficking, you know, like, and the best student of the IMF and the World Bank. So, you know, like the lack of reporting, the lack of interest then means that when you arrive and you try to cover, and then again, you know, I think there has been very little interest for such a huge story, I believe, of a lot of implication, what has been going in Nicaragua in the past year, all these killings and everything, you know, like people don't get it, especially if you have like 30-second bulletin in the radio, you know, like 800 piece, you know, in a newspaper, you know, because of course there are other more important things to talk about, and so we're not doing that as well. It's not only that we are following, you know, like the whims of presidential palaces and covering things when and if they fit certain narratives and agenda, but by doing so, of course, we are not, you know, like allowing people to understand the complexities of whatever is a complex region. No?
Absolutely.
And yeah.
Nicaragua, you know, and Central America.
No, I was thinking of something you were saying, and I was thinking of something that happened to me that's symptomatic, I think. When I arrived in Brazil, it was after the Olympics, after the World Cup, and I just arrived when all the journalists, all the correspondents were leaving. And it was really strange, no? Like the impeachment to Dilma Rousseff, like theoretically, no, the most iconic things had happened, no? And it's strange how it works in Latin America, no? Like there are like 200 journalists during, I don't know, the World Cup or and after they leave, and it's really, I think it's symptomatic, no? And during these 2 years, for example, a lot has happened in Brazil, no? With Bolsonaro now, but it's sometimes undercovered, no? Because it was supposed to be like not so interesting now, and we need to be there also, no? And
As a Spanish journalist, I think it's really particular, the relationship we have with America Latina. And it's, for me, sometimes embarrassing how people in Latin America are so interested in us, like they know what's happening in Spain. I'm from Barcelona, and they ask, oh, what's the independence thing? And they know lots of things about us. And it's so embarrassing when I don't know, talking to friends or, I don't know, people don't know a lot of things about America Latina, no? It's more sometimes stereotypes, like a lot of cliches. And also sometimes I think, for example, maybe Venezuela, it's more the most iconic example of that, but how sometimes, no? For example, for Spain, Venezuela, it's been like a political issue for us. Like, people are using, politics are using Venezuela, no? In an intern way, let's say it. I don't know if I say it correctly in English, but and we see also the peaks, no? Like, everybody's interested in Venezuela. I don't know, when Juan Guaido says he's the president now, and we have two presidents, and there's, I don't know, this huge apagón, no, where the lights on the country disappear for so many hours, and after we forgot about it. And I don't know, I think it's quite symbolic, like how...
Symbolic, yeah.
Like the relationship we have, not only in Europe, but in my case, particularly in Spain, no? I feel a little bit uncomfortable with it.
So I wonder, like, can we think of examples maybe of coverage that we've done that had to fit within, you know, that couldn't be complete because of what the, you know, the internal politics were maybe in Spain or something like that. I mean, I can think of a few examples. As a freelance, I was, you know, 2 years ago, I was like on the US-Mexico border. I got a grant, which is so, you know, it's so important for us freelancers, and it's so rare. And I got a grant to spend a month, thanks to the IWMF, on the US-Mexico border, covering issues in Chihuahua that did not have to do with migration. They were, you know, I went to, you know, a women's jail. I went to an indigenous jail. I was covering stuff on Mennonites, like, you know, the beautiful features that like a freelance always like hopes and dreams of like covering. And it's been almost impossible to tell these stories, because every time I get in touch with an editor, they're like, oh, US-Mexico border, sure, but what's the migration angle? I'm like, no, this is not a story about migration. This is a story about something else. I mean, there are other things happening. And, you know, the answer of the editors has always been like, oh, but it would be so odd to have this story, like, you know, this doesn't fit within like any coverage. So, you know, what are the stories that we're not covering because of what's happening
most
there?
of them. Most of them. I mean, we can make a list of, and you're very well placed as well, you know, like to do this, a list of the things that, you know, like we do cover, or the stereotypes that's in a certain way we feed, you know, like there is of course migration, but only recently. You know, like Central Americans and Mexicans have been migrating to the United States for a long, long, long time. You know, as I said, it was only when, you know, suddenly, you know, Obama made a policy issue of all these children stranded in the border, you know, like that's, everybody started paying attention, but this had been going on for years, you know, like the same way that, you know, like people only started realizing that migrants were being killed in horrible ways in Mexico as they crossed, Central American migrants as they went through Mexico, you know, like when they discovered this mass grave. You know, and El Faro, for example, which is a great Salvadorian portal that does, in my opinion, best journalism in Spanish language in the whole world, you know, like from El Salvador. You know, like I had been reporting on that for a long, long time. You have this magnificent book by Oscar Martinez, in English it's called The Beast, La Bestia. In Spanish it's called Los migrantes que no importan, immigranti que no importan, the immigrants that don't matter, you know. So migration is one, you know, drug trafficking, of course, is the other big one. You know, I was in Colombia, and pretty much everything people wanted to know about Colombia was about drug traffickers. Like there was a peace process going on. Like a huge historical moment in Latin American politics, and it was so hard to get people interested in that. And now even more so, because of Narcos. People know more about Colombia because of a Netflix series, called Narcos, that because of the reporting we have been doing, in a fascinating, complex country, and I guess the left, this idea of Latin America as in one given moment, it was like the big white hope, or maybe not that white hope of the left, and that's it.
Yeah. I would just add in here. I mean, I think there's a couple of trends that are taking place in Latin America which are epical and really important, and they're only covered tangentially or editorially in passing in order to write or talk about events that are taking place now. One is the eclipse of the left in Latin America, which Arturo just alluded to, and the takeover by the right in a region that has for the better part of the last 20 years tended to the left. And in the case of Brazil, the biggest country, it's a continent-sized country, it's now in the hands of an ultra-rightist and who is very, very close and who models himself on Donald Trump. And he's also made common cause with and extended friendship with Salvini here in Italy. So it's important. Latin America is now important because of these larger trends, these ideological trends which we're seeing take place towards authoritarian populism around the world. It's a region that has only been formally democratic in the past generation. And of course, it's failed in that regard. You are also seeing another trend which I don't think many people have really grasped yet because it's early days, but a kind of remilitarization is taking place in the hemisphere just 30 years after the ceasefires and the return, many times for the first time ever, the restoration of democracy or the beginning of democracy in these countries which were traditionally led by military dictators. In Brazil, not only does Bolsonaro, this fascist, this neo-fascist, have 8 out of his 22 cabinet members are military men. There is also, the army is now deployed permanently in Rio de Janeiro to do battle with crime. In Mexico, it's been 10 years that the army has been deployed domestically to fight the drug wars with tragic and uncertain results. It's clearly not an issue. Trump has sent, for the first time ever, troops to the Mexican border. We see it as a joke, but nonetheless, this is a serious advent. And we're seeing places like Colombia, which tends to get overlooked because of narcos and these other things. It is the most militarized country in the Western Hemisphere after the United States. It has 500,000 people under arms. It's the biggest army after the United States. And it still has the Western Hemisphere's last active insurgency. The Ejército de Liberación Nacional is a Guevarist force that's been in the field since 1964. The FARC came in from the cold, as we know, 2 years ago. But because the right wing is now in power again, and they're undoing the peace process, which brought the FARC out of the bush after 52 years, there's quite a bit of attrition, and there is now people staying in the field and others returning. And they're returning to kind of hot zones that are also linked to cocaine production. But the ELN remains in the field, and it's also now quite operational in southern Venezuela, where there's a lot of mines, and it's out of control. The government's, quite apart from the rights or wrongs of the Maduro government, it's beside the point in a way. The government in Caracas, in a way, Venezuela is a kind of failed state in the sense that it has an inability to control. It doesn't have the monopoly on violence, and there seems to be a kind of entente cordiale between the regime and the ELN to control the militias who had taken over their mining arc. And so these in a kind of Congolese-style scenario. So we're seeing a kind of the attrition or the implosion of the state in a lot of countries, and we're also seeing its remilitarization at a time when clearly civilian constituencies feel that the institutions, civic institutions have failed them. In Brazil, there's a reason why Bolsonaro won, you know, and it's because of a series of corruption scandals. Whatever we feel about Lula, whether he was railroaded or not, there is a scenario in which the average Brazilian, or many average Brazilians, feel that their institutions have failed them. They can no longer trust the political class. This, as we know, leads to authoritarianism everywhere. And so that's something we're seeing. Let's see what happens now next in, you know, Argentina, or in Peru, or in, you know, will this become a hemispheric phenomenon? As the left is eclipsed, and in the case of Brazil, there's also a restoration of Cold War dialectic and language. They talk about the need to eliminate communists. They talk as if this was 1973. They talk about the need to, you know, to kill communists and other people. And there's also a huge turn against identity politics, which has been associated with the left, with liberal politics in Europe, in North America, and to the extent that it had gone anywhere forward in the sort of liberal left democracies of Latin America. A great deal of this upwelling by the right against their institutions and towards populism has to do precisely for the same reasons, with gay marriage, with emancipatory politics that help women or African Brazilians or indigenous people. And I would just end on one. So I think these are all important trend lines to keep in mind. We're all connected. We live in a globalized world, and Latin America is part of it, you know. And in a way, it's much more part of it than it was in, let's say, World War II. The last time you had a big globalized event that involved a huge conflagration here, and with, of course, with tremendous consequences for Latin America. Millions of Europeans fled the Spanish Civil War and then fascism in Europe, and eventually communism too, and make up those populations. And there are countries like Italy, like Portugal and Spain, which have a kind of retroalimentación between those countries and ours. And with the globalized economies, and increasingly, once again, dangerously, toxically, I think, politics, we're seeing ourselves drawn together in new and maybe unexpected ways. I would just like to add one little thing, like you had Nicaragua as your favorite thing. I feel that, so these are trend lines I think we have to be aware of, and if we want to have an idea when we go out and report, maybe we should think of one of these ideas, one of these matices, one of these trend lines as ours, you know, as something beyond, even if we're young and a freelancer in some back of beyond place that nobody really cares about. Maybe we have a bigger idea we carry with us, and maybe that can help lead us to something deeper and more rigorous and more profound, and we can contribute in ways that we don't even realize we can yet, like with a documentary film or a book, or just a deeper way of thinking about the place we're in. Maybe it gives us a better sense of purpose, and actually a deeper purpose in what we do. But in the same way that there are certain regions that are just never get a look in. There's one, I would say, that is probably, to my mind, the great dramatic story. Really, it's white noise because it's always been there. No, it's the far west of Brazil. It's the far west. Mm-hmm. It's the last great wilderness. It's the last great place where we're seeing what took place in the United States or in Argentina in the 1870s is taking place as we speak in Brazil, in the Amazon, along the border between there's a Europe-sized area between Peru, roughly, down to Bolivia, and in Brazil, which is a vast wilderness about the size of Western Europe. In this area alone, about 70 of the last 100 isolated peoples live. These are the original people, and they're being killed off. You know, who is going in there? We're not going in there. Who's going in? Narcos, gold prospectors, every manner of villain that you can think of, and freebooter trying to make a buck. And now you have a guy in office in Brazil who wants to get rid of them. This is a man who might as well be a cowboy who's just, you know, they have yet to expand, they have yet to take over their territory. This is 1870. And he wants to finally kill off the Indians and everybody else that stands in the way of progress. They still don't have a railroad all the way through. You know, they don't have control of their territory. So the great showdown between modernity and the ancient world is taking place right before our eyes, off the pages of the newspapers, with just rare exceptions of anecdotal programs that take place. And it's really a tremendous story. I would, if I was, you know, a 20-year-old young and adventurous, that's where I would go. On my last trip to Brazil, I did go there. I spent a few days with the Chavante Indians because I think it's important you don't just get caught up in the metropolitan problems, you know, Sao Paulo, Rio, Brasilia. And I made an effort to go out there. I think it's important. But these are, to me, this is an epic that's taking place, and it's unfolding just beyond the horizon, and nobody's watching it happen. And that's, to me, an amazing undercovered story, the ultimate undercovered story. Because when it's over, that's it. There is no more. It's like Antarctica melting, or the polar ice cap melting. Once it's gone, it's gone. That's it.
I was thinking, Carola, maybe you can tell us, I mean, you know, thinking about the big stories that we try and look for deeper, like you worked for a while on a project on Balas Perdidas, on the Lost Bullets, and it was kind of like your big project in Brazil, and it told another story, or it tried to tell another story, and that had a lot of impact. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about that.
Okay. Well, also I think there's the thing that you've mentioned, but also reporting in America Latina has this particularity of violence, no? Of living in really violent cities. For example, I lived in Caracas. I lived in, well, Mexico, DF. I think it's not that violent to me now. And after I lived in Rio, where there's this battle between policemen and people in drug traffickers in favelas, and I don't know, it's sometimes difficult not just like to go out of the stereotype and to try to explain these stories in a profound way and in a different way, no? And I was really worried, for example, in Balas Perdidas, in trying to explain how it is for a carioca, no, for anyone living in Rio de Janeiro in a favela, living every day with bullets just coming and returning, no, and it's horrible. And what we tried to do, it was with AFP that we did that, is going to try to find victims of balas perdidas, no, like most of them were like children, because sometimes police say it's, oh, they were traffickers, but how can a 3-year-old be a trafficker, no? So we found like 8 families that were victims of that violence, and we went to their homes and just sat and with them and tried to, I don't know, understand a little bit more how it is, no? How do, in different angles, no? How you manage to continue living, how you, I don't know, from the activism to the, I don't know. And I think it was like a good effort and a good piece, no? A good, it's strange to say it as we did it, but I think it had an impact, and it was like a way people also that don't live in Brazil can understand, maybe, no? You can see a lot of people that you can empathize with. And I don't know, thinking of these stories that we try to see different angles. There's Carolina Guerrero over there, that's the CEO of Radio Ambulante, which is great. If you don't know them, you have to. And
if you want to practice your Spanish?
Yeah, you really have to. And I had the pleasure to produce 2 stories for them. It's one thing that Irene was explaining before, because it was really strange for me working in countries where so many colleagues were being killed. You know, it's like my se me eriza la piel. It's horrible, no? Because we are, I don't know how to say the word, not privilegiados, but we are. And I was really in Mexico. It's one of the countries that most that most journalists are killed. And there's a particular region, Veracruz, that was like really like the red area for journalists. And I wanted to do like a story, a big story about it. And even if maybe in news agencies we tend to run and I don't know, I also encourage like young people or young journalists here. I try to do other things apart from my job, like extra hours. And I was obsessed with that, and I did like a piece on that that's called La Unión in Radio Ambulante that was about like the story of a Mexican like activist, let's say neighbor, that had his own like newspaper, really simple, and he was killed. His son tried after. Well, I don't want to do spoilers. Maybe you should listen to it. But I think it's important also to take our time to do long stories, even if I don't know. I maybe lost money traveling there, but to me it was worth it, no? And I think it has this value, like being there and also being conscious that we are privileged in some way, and we have to tell the stories that they cannot tell because their life is in risk. So I don't know.
Yeah, and so I'm going to open it up to the public in a second, but just maybe as an end note, it's true that we are privileged, and I totally agree that, you know...
Some more than others?
Some more than others, you know, freelancers struggle, but it's always good to get a chance to follow your, you know, your instinct and go after those stories. And amazingly, there's a lot of great independent journalism coming up in Latin America right now. We get Radio Ambulante represented here. There's Michal here, who's like fostering like new media in Argentina. But there are a lot of great media. We can mention a few. There's El Faro, there's Radio Ambulante, and I think that's you know, that tells you a story. Like there are stories, different stories that are trying to be told. And it's not just the foreign correspondents doing it, which is important to remember. And there are people like really, you know, risking their lives to do it. And so we should always keep that in mind. We are privileged. I totally think so. And so with that in mind, questions, please.
Opinions, questions.
So over here, maybe we can start. Do we have the microphone? Abbiamo il microfono oppure facciamo senza? Ah, ok. So, over qua. Ah, ok. È qua un altro. Thank you. Yeah. So maybe we'll take a couple and then we can keep going. One and one.
All right. All right. I'm Renato. I'm a journalist from Brazil. I used to work for the mainstream media there, and then after a couple of years, I moved on to the most progressive media in Brazil, and I'd like to offer some constructive criticism on the specific subject of the European coverage of what's been going on there. The thing is, my teacher, one of my teachers, fought the dictatorship in Brazil in the 70s, and he used to say that he would inform himself through BBC during that time because he couldn't rely on our national mainstream press, which is, as I'm sure you know, more of an oligarchy of information than a proper journalistic enterprise. Anyway, so I wouldn't say that a person fighting an authorist regimen in Brazil today would be able to do the same, because the coverage we get in Brazil is normally reactive, and because it's reactive, it ends up relying on what the mainstream media says. It's very difficult to get a new perspective, say, on The Guardian or on BBC, because when interesting things happen, you tend to go there and inform yourselves on the moment, thus getting the information from those who control the narrative.
I disagree.
With the possible exception of El País, which is doing an amazing job there.
Let me just jump in, but the Guardian has a correspondent in Rio. He's all over the place all the time. There's stories every day, every other day, quite well reported from Brazil. I think you're wrong on the case of the Guardian. I don't have any skin in the game for the Guardian necessarily, but I think you're a little bit sweeping in your criticism of particular organs. It's not only parachute journalism that takes place. There are correspondents for the various media who live in the country and who've gotten to know it and who report on it.
No, what I'm trying to say is that most of the time, I read the Guardian a lot. I think your publication is great in general, but
I don't work for the Guardian.
Oh, sorry.
I work for the New Yorker.
Yeah. Sorry.
Which is also good, no worries.
The way you said, sorry.
It's okay.
I read the Guardian a lot. The thing is, I feel that there's a lot of he said, she said journalism in there, and I would like to ask first, how do you guys feel you could make a more a journalism with a fresher perspective from that point of view, as El País is doing it right now? And in second place, how would a contributor from that country would go about, offering something to you guys?
Yeah, actually we can start answering because it's an interesting one, and I in a way I agree with you. I think part of the problem is that international media are not putting the resources they used to put or to have it. It doesn't only happen in Latin America; it happens everywhere in the world. But the first victim of the crisis of, for instance, print media have been the foreign desk. And of course, how can you do, original journalism, proper journalism? You have to be there, and that's the difference. País has people there, and very often you have, from many outlets, you might have somebody in Mexico covering the whole region, or in Brazil covering the whole region, and of course, and you have to react to everyday news, and so you don't have time to pursue, bigger stories and so on and so forth. At the same time, though, even though I always enjoy these romantic references to the BBC, that even the Nazis used to listen to the BBC because they believed the BBC and not the Reich propaganda. Of course, I'm sure the coverage was also much more limited and only to a few things, a few moments, because that was the trick of the trade. I remember, and also because that was what technology allowed back then. Fewer stories, you had more time actually to work on something before it became part of a broader conversation and so on and so forth. And so you might have actually a broader, better, in a way, coverage today, despite these problems, But yeah, I agree with you. We do in a lot of media just, reversion stories, brought by others, or we use a lot of local media, and I believe when Carola was talking about and Irene before about how deadly Latin American is for journalists and how privileged we are. I remember in Colombia I used to say that the big debt that we owe to all the local journalists doing a great job without which we couldn't do ours. Because we go and we build on their work, and probably we have some advantages, distance and resources and, some sort of protection, credibility, whatever. But of course, without them, we wouldn't even, know what we should be talking about. But of course, at the same time, if you are not there, if you don't have the resources, of course, it's very difficult to do proper original journalism, and that's a problem. That's the big problem, and the solution is actually to put more resources. Where those will come from. But I also believe, and that's the thing. Even though I do believe in the ecology, in the ecosystem of media, there is still a role for this big media organization and international press and so on and so forth. As we mentioned before, you also have a lot of local journalists, a lot of local outlets, doing the best. Great journalism, and they are the one who are better placed to actually to explain that a country and explain those problems. And for instance, what we try to do in BBC Mundo, for instance, is we have a partnership with El Faro, and what we do is we let El Faro, Salvadorian journalists, Central American journalists, tell stories about Central America. Of course, we do our stories as well. I would kill myself if I wasn't allowed, to go to Central America every now and then. But of course, if you have great local journalists doing that job, why not partner with them, to make that possible?
Hello, I would like to ask, I think this is more directed to Arturo, that if narratives change depending on the outlet you work. For instance, is there a difference between working in a public diplomacy media as BBC or in a mainstream media?
Yeah, I mean, of course. I always say that journalists are just like one element of the end product that is there. For instance, I always say that in Nicaragua, Central America, there's always better journalists than journalism. Yeah. Because of course you also have the editors, the publishers, the interest, the time, the resources you are given to, and of course different media have different agendas. Some have clear interests in advancing. Some are have a remit which is a little more just break the news no matter what no matter what, or etc. And it makes a difference, in terms of resources, in terms of political pressure, and so on and so forth. Of course, for everybody it's different. And sometimes at the same time, not even a public media such as the BBC, is completely immune to some of the pressures that many other media are feeling. We also are measured in terms of traffic. For instance, we want to prove that the British license fee payers are getting something in exchange of the money they're putting in us covering a lot of faraway countries in many different languages. We have 43 different languages, for instance, at the BBC. And of course, so we want to have traffic, and sometimes that force us to make compromises, and we are not doing this public service journalism the whole time, or at least we are trying to find creative. So not even the BBC is immune to some pressure, but of course there is a big difference depending on who pays for your salary, and how it's structured, how your organization is structured, what their goals are, how their values are, principles, and so on and so forth. Yeah.
Question here, then here, and we'll see.
Hi. Is it on? I was, do you want me to stand up? Okay. I was bureau chief in Mexico City for the Financial Times for 4 years, and I'd agree with almost everything that's been said from the panel. Boy, was that a privileged position to be in, and it felt privileged at the time. You have much more protection with embassies behind you than the local correspondents do, and that gives you a chance to do some actual real journalism. To try to make two slightly contrarian points just to make the conversation a little more interesting, because we all agree that Latin America is poorly covered in Europe. Firstly, I do think you should treat the lack of interest by newsrooms in Latin America as almost an opportunity. I guess mainly I can say that because I was a staff journalist, but if they're not pestering you for stories, you can go out and find out what the real news is, and then do your best with your journalistic nous to explain that to them. So while the Iraq war was going on, a month went by with London never once phoning us, ever. We could have gone to Acapulco for a month and nobody would have known. But that meant we could go and find out, got to know about the López Obrador phenomenon, which turned out to be very good to have spent time knowing about him. We could find out the effect Chinese competition was having on Mexican industry, and so on and so forth. So I do think that we should think of it as an advantage to some extent that newsrooms aren't that interested at the moment in the big story. The other thing, and people are going to think I'm being pathetically right-wing or establishment or whatever, there is good news out of Latin America. I went to Peru recently for the first time in 25 years. There are many, many, many terrible, profound problems in Peru still. Compared to what it was like when I first went there in '88 under Alan Garcia and the Sendero Luminoso were more or less in control of much of the country. It's extraordinary how much things have improved there. Yeah. I believe you can say something similar about Colombia.
Despite the fact that 4 of its last presidents have either gone to jail or are going to jail for corruption.
Yes, exactly. I know it's still a basket case, but somehow things have got a bit better there.
Okay.
Yeah, I
sure.
mean,
I would disagree,
I think
but
there's
anyway.
different good news. I think there's like, yeah, but thank you for that.
Hello. Good afternoon.
Yeah, you can go.
Good afternoon. First of all, I would like to make a statement and also then a challenge to you. And my name is Mafalda Avelar. I'm a Portuguese journalist who have been working during years in Brazil, so in local newspapers. And plus, I also have been a foreign correspondent in Europe. So I think we can put everything together. My first statement is the following. I think all of us recognize here that the four of you has a lovely light in your eyes. And I think that this is very important when we cover Latin America. I think a good journalist has to be passionate, cannot only know, but has to feel. And I can recognize that on you. And I think this is very important for all of us that are hearing you. And the other thing that I would like to tell you is that, and to share with you, I worked with the best professionals of ever in Brazil. Very good and I've been working in different countries. Actually, I'm the former deputy editor-in-chief of our national news agency in Portugal. So I've been working with a lot of people all these years, but the good people in Brazil, the good journalists, they are state-of-the-art. So we cannot say that the professionals from Brazil are not so good. No, this is not a fact. We have to be objective. People are really, really good. So having said that, I think that the media world in Latin America is under a big challenge, as all over the world, as we can feel. And especially in Brazil, the reality, I know more, Brazil and Argentina, I think that they have not only the problem of the democratic transition, that I think that nowadays we live that, but also a problem of fear. And when I say fear, you spoke about violence. You spoke about corruption. Sorry, I didn't hear you because I arrived a little bit late. But I think that the problem right now, and for instance, in the case of Bolsonaro, I really think that Bolsonaro won because of a world violence. People have fear and they want to run from violence. And when you don't have nothing to lose, is a big question mark in the world. So I just want to make this statement with you. I think it's very important to consider the others and Latin American journalists very good because they are. And, but only it's very important to know that we are living a process of fear and of violence. And this, when we don't have nothing to lose, we can become extremists. And this is a problem. And then the challenge that I want to give to put to all of you. I know quite well Amazonia. Before I left Brazil, I spent 1 month. And if one of you want to make a big report with me, you can do it.
Okay. Do we have, I think we're done? One more question over here.
Then we can do it
over
in the bar.
here. Sorry, over here and then there.
Yeah,
okay.
I just wanted to say thank you so much for the panel today. There was a lot of parallels for me. I cover West Africa, specifically Francophone West Africa. So the questions of migration, of people only wanting one angle while a huge story is happening, such as the collapse of the Sahel where I am, and no one really caring about that. One question that I turn over a lot in my mind reporting from that region is what are the obligations you feel to your local audience? So I think a lot about my African audience where I am, whether they'll actually read or consume anything that I produce and how I can reach them. For me, the answer to that was to start doing some radio because a lot of my audience is illiterate. And I just wondered whether you had considered that question and whether it was an important consideration for you.
Let's take the other question as well, quickly. Or is there?
Mike.
And maybe we can start answering this. I mean, I often think about the local audience. I think radio definitely works. In Latin America, there is definitely, I mean, I usually report in English. Whenever I get the chance to have my work translated into Spanish, I take it. Like, you know, BBC has like translations, etc., so that helps a lot. But I think it is very important to give back. And I don't think there is a solution if you're reporting on in a different language or in different media. It's not always that easy, and I always try to like give back personally. I go back with my reports, I show it to them, etc. It's not you know, it's something. I think it's important to keep it in mind. I don't know if someone else says.
Yeah, well, I think we can continue the conversation in a cafe or a bar.
Yeah, you can come.